At dawn on June 28, 548 AD, servants fed cartload after cartload of documents into the palace furnaces while Theodora, the dying empress of Byzantium, supervised from her bed. Purple light streamed through windows she'd positioned years earlier for this exact moment, casting shadows across her cancer-hollowed face as she pointed a skeletal finger toward another stack. The crackling of parchment, mixed with frankincense smoke, filling the purple room with the acrid scent of burning secrets. Her scribes worked frantically beside her, scratching out final orders between fits of her wet, rattling cough. These weren't ordinary papers feeding the flames. These were the blackmail files of Constantinople's elite senators' confessions, whispered in her pleasure pools, priests' appetites documented by muted servants, evidence of acts performed in chambers where marble floors opened to underground rivers, 30 years of sexual surveillance turning to ash. Each document represented a life she'd owned, a fortune she'd extracted, a throat she could have cut with a word. The servants' hands trembled as they recognized names, dates, detailed accounts of degradations that would have meant exile or execution. The woman they called history's most perverted empress was ensuring her secrets died with her, but the architecture couldn't burn. How did a bearkeeper's daughter who performed with geese in Constantinople's gutters transform the Byzantine Empire into her personal network of sexual surveillance and architectural debauchery? To find out, we need to descend into the bear pits where it all began, where a 5-year-old girl learned her first lesson about power. The bear's massive paw swept through iron bars, catching nothing but air, as 5-year-old Theodora pressed herself against the stone wall. Her father Acacius lay 3 feet away on the straw-covered floor, his breathing shallow and wet. The scratch on his forearm had turned black overnight. By morning, red streaks climbed toward his shoulder like poisonous vines. Down here in the hippodrome's underground, death came fast and stupid. Not from the bears or lions that roared in their cages. Not from the gladiators sharpening their blades in the armory. From a single claw scratch that any physician could have treated if bearkeepers could afford physicians. Theodora's mother knelt beside him, calculating. 3 daughters. No income, no protection. The math was simple and brutal. Without their father's position as bearkeeper to the Green faction, they'd be on the streets within days, maybe hours. The underground tunnels thundered with preparation for the afternoon races. Charioteers tested their vehicles. Animals paced. Slaves hauled carcasses from yesterday's games. The familiar chaos that had been Theodora's entire world now felt like a countdown. Her father's fingers twitched, reaching for something invisible. His lips moved without sound. Then nothing. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats before her mother stood, smoothing her worn tunic with hands that didn't shake. She'd already planned their next move. 2 days later, Theodora stood in the hippodrome's vast arena, wearing white ribbons in her hair. The afternoon sun beat down on 40,000 spectators as her mother led all 3 daughters to the center of the track. Comito, the eldest at 10, Theodora at 5, baby Anastasia in their mother's arms, all dressed in supplicants' white, all holding olive branches. The crowd quieted, recognizing the ritual, a widow begging for her dead husband's position to pass to a new protector, a public auction of desperation. They approached the Green faction section first. These were their people, their father's employers. Surely they would help. The faction leaders looked down from their privileged seats, conferring among themselves. One of them laughed. The answer came swift and public. No. The Greens had already chosen Acacius's replacement. The widow and her daughters could find their charity elsewhere. 40,000 people watched a mother's humiliation. But Theodora wasn't watching her mother. She was memorizing faces. The Green faction leader who'd laughed. The men who'd looked away. The women who'd whispered behind their fans. She studied them with the focused intensity of a child who'd just discovered that memory could be a weapon. Her mother didn't hesitate. She turned immediately toward the Blue faction's section, her daughters trailing behind like ducklings. The Blues and Greens hated each other with the passion reserved for sports rivalries that masked deeper political divisions. Taking the Green Bearkeeper's family would be an insult, a small victory in their eternal war. The Blue faction leader stood, making a show of his magnanimity. Yes, they would take the widow. Her new husband would assume the bearkeeper position. The girls would be fed, housed, protected. The crowd applauded this demonstration of Byzantine charity, but Theodora heard what the adults missed. The blue leader's exact words, "We'll find use for all of them." The way he looked at her older sister Comito, already beautiful at 10. The calculating glances at Theodora herself. Even baby Anastasia was assessed and catalogued. They'd traded one cage for another. The family's new protector arrived that evening. Theodora watched from the doorway as he inspected their quarters, their possessions, their bodies. His hands lingered on her mother's waist. His eyes lingered on Comito. When he noticed Theodora watching, he smiled. That smile told her everything. Within a month, their mother was pregnant. Within 6 months, she was arranging Comito's first public performance, not with bears. The other kind of performance, the kind that happened in the theatres adjoining the hippodrome, where actresses and prostitutes were legally the same profession. Theodora learned to pick pockets from the performers. She learned to read people's desires from the prostitutes. She learned to disappear when her stepfather drank. She learned that information was currency, and that everyone, even the bears, had secrets worth knowing. The hippodrome taught its lessons in blood and applause, but the most important lesson came the day a senator's wife visited the underground chambers, seeking discreet entertainment. Theodora watched her stepfather grovel, watched him take the woman's gold, watched him promise discretion. Then she watched him sell that same information to the woman's enemies. Sex, secrets, gold, power. The equation was so simple even a 7-year-old could understand it. She started small, listening at doorways, memorizing pillow talk, learning which gladiators preferred boys, which charioteers bet against themselves, which priests visited after dark. Information she traded for food, for protection, for reading lessons from a disgraced scholar who worked as a betting tout. But childhood ended the day her stepfather looked at her the way he looked at Comito. The theatre reeked of sweat and wine, and something else 12-year-old Theodora couldn't name yet. She stood naked backstage while stagehands scattered barley across her body, the grains sticking to oil they'd rubbed into her skin. Through the curtain came the sound of silk rustling against marble benches. Constantinople's elite had paid extra for this special performance. The other actresses whispered warnings. Hold still when the geese came. Don't flinch. Don't scream. The men in the audience wanted to see control break down slowly, grain by grain. They'd throw coins if she lasted long enough. They'd throw more if she didn't. Theodora counted the grains on her stomach. Mathematics kept her mind sharp while her body became commodity. Each grain represented a copper coin if she performed well. Each coin meant another day of bread for Anastasia, still too young for the stage. The accounting mattered more than the shame. The curtain rose. Torchlight caught the oil on her skin, turning her into something golden and unreal. She registered faces in the crowd with the same detachment she'd once catalogued bears in cages. Senator Hypatius in the 3rd row, his wife nowhere in sight. Bishop Constantine, who preached against the theatres every Sunday, leaning forward in his seat. Young Narses, the emperor's treasurer, taking notes on a wax tablet. She wondered what he was writing. The thought almost made her smile. The first goose waddled on stage to scattered applause. Its handler, an old drunk named Marcus, steered it toward her with practiced indifference. The bird's black eyes studied her the way she studied the audience, calculating, waiting. The goose's beak struck her thigh, pecking at the first grain. Sharp enough to sting, not enough to scar. The audience murmured approval. She kept her breathing steady, her face blank. This was the game. They wanted to see her composure crack. She wanted their gold. More geese joined the first. 3, then 5, then 7. Their beaks worked methodically across her body, following the trail of barley from her ankles to her throat. The pain built in layers. First irritation, then genuine hurt, then something worse as their beaks found tender places. Senator Hypatius shifted in his seat. She memorized the movement. The rules were simple. No crying out, no protecting herself, no breaking position until the last grain was gone. The actress who'd trained her had lasted 6 minutes. The record was 8. Theodora had been counting since the first peck. 4 minutes. Her skin burned where the beaks had struck repeatedly. 5 minutes. Hypatius was sweating now, his hand moving beneath his toga. She filed that information away too. 6 minutes. The younger geese grew aggressive, fighting over the remaining grains clustered at her collarbone. Their wings beat against her face. Their claws scratched lines down her ribs. The audience had gone silent except for heavy breathing and the scratch of Narcis's stylus on wax. 7 minutes. Only a handful of grains remained, stuck to the oil between her breasts, where the geese had to work harder to reach them. One particularly ambitious bird climbed onto her stomach, its full weight pressing down as it stretched for the last barley. 8 minutes. The final grain disappeared into a goose's gullet. Marcus whistled, calling his birds back. They waddled off stage as casually as they'd arrived, leaving Theodora alone in the torchlight. Her skin was a map of red marks and rising bruises. The audience erupted. Gold coins rained onto the stage. Real gold, not copper. More than she'd seen in her entire life. She didn't move to collect them. Not yet. First, she stood slowly, letting them see the damage their entertainment had caused. Then she bowed with the grace her mother had taught her, the kind of bow that suggested breeding despite everything. Backstage, the other actresses counted her coins with undisguised envy. 43 gold pieces. Enough to feed her family for months. Enough to bribe their way to better quarters. Enough to matter. But Theodora wasn't thinking about the gold. She was thinking about Senator Hypatius, and the way his breathing had changed at minute 6. About Bishop Constantine's hands gripping his knees. About whatever Narcissus had been writing with such careful attention. The goose handler Marcus stumbled over, seeking his cut of the profits. She gave him 5 gold pieces without argument. Then, while he marvelled at his fortune, she asked the question that mattered. Who requests private performances? Marcus laughed, spraying wine-scented spittle. Anyone with enough gold, girl. Why, you thinking of expanding your repertoire already? She wasn't thinking about performing. She was thinking about the kind of information that powerful men revealed when they thought they were alone with something they'd purchased. About how Bishop Constantine's congregation would react to knowing where he spent his Thursday nights. About what Senator Hypatius's wife might pay to learn why her husband preferred watching geese to sharing her bed. The theatre had taught her that bodies were currency. But bodies broke down, aged out, became worthless. Information, properly managed, appreciated in value forever. That night, she started her first ledger. Names, dates, preferences observed, weaknesses noted. She wrote in a cipher she'd developed, mixing Greek letters with street slang symbols. Each entry was an investment in a future where she wouldn't need geese or stages or Marcus's whiskey breath counting out copper coins. Within a month, she'd identified patterns. Which senators arrived together but left separately? Which priests blessed themselves before entering? Which merchants paid in foreign gold that shouldn't have been in their possession? The theatre was a marketplace of secrets, and she was its most careful accountant. But careful wasn't enough when the man who owned your contract decided he wanted a private audition. Asterius ran the Blue Faction's theatrical enterprises with the same brutality he'd once applied to gladiator matches. When he summoned Theodora to his chambers above the theatre, she knew the 43 gold pieces had drawn his attention. Success in Constantinople was its own kind of danger. His rooms stank of garum and incense, the kind of mixture that made her stomach turn. He gestured to a couch with one fat-fingered hand while pouring wine with the other. She remained standing. "I hear you've developed quite a following," he said, not bothering to look at her directly. Senators, priests, even caught Narcissus' attention, and he usually prefers watching the boy dancers. She said nothing. Information flowed towards silence. 43 gold pieces for one performance. That's a record. My record, technically, since I own your contract. He finally looked at her then, his eyes cataloguing her the way hers catalogued the audience. "I'm thinking we need to renegotiate our arrangement." The wine cup in his hand was silver, inscribed with scenes she recognized from mythology. Leda and the swan, Europa and the bull. The gods had always preferred their rapes dressed up as transformation. "The standard theatrical contract gives you 60%, she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I've never disputed that. 60% of standard earnings. But you're not standard anymore, are you?" He stood, moving closer. His breath competed with the garum for which smell would make her vomit first. Special merchandise requires special handling. She knew what came next, had watched it happen to Comito, to every girl who showed promise or profit. The private auditions, the special clients, the gradual transformation from actress to exclusive property. Her sister now lived in a senator's villa, visiting their mother once a month with hollow eyes and expensive jewelry. But Theodora had spent 7 years preparing for this moment. "Bishop Constantine would be disappointed," she said quietly. "He specifically requested that I remain available for his Thursday visits. Something about the purity of public performance versus private corruption. He was quite eloquent on the subject last week." Asteria stopped moving. "Constantine doesn't visit the theatres. Room 6, third couch from the left. Always arrives during the second act when the doorkeeper changes shifts. Pays in temple gold, which is technically theft from God." She smiled then, the kind of smile she'd learned from watching successful predators. "Would you like to know what sounds he makes when the geese reach the barley on my throat? I could describe it quite accurately." The silence stretched between them like a tightening rope. "You're lying. Marcus keeps records of the special requests. So do I. Mine are more detailed." She pulled a small scroll from her belt, one she'd prepared for this exact moment. "Would you like to see your entry? You prefer redheads, but they have to cry. Real tears, not the fake ones achieved with onion juice. Last month you paid extra for." He grabbed for the scroll. She stepped back, letting it unfurl just enough for him to see his name in her careful cipher. The blood drained from his face as he recognized other names. Too many names. Too many secrets for one 12-year-old girl to know. "What do you want?" Now she sat on his couch, crossing her legs with deliberate ease. "I want to keep performing. Standard contract, standard terms. No private auditions. No special handling. And I want to pick my own material. The audience won't. The audience will pay to see whatever I show them. They always have." She stood, rolling the scroll back up. "Oh, and I'll need access to the visiting merchant performances. The ones you host after hours for foreign traders." His jaw worked soundlessly. She waited, counting heartbeats the way she'd once counted goosepecks. At 43, he found his voice. "If any of that information, then we'd both burn. But I'm 12, legally a prostitute, as you so often remind me. Who would believe I could write, much less maintain records?" She moved toward the door, then paused. Although Bishop Constantine might believe it, he's surprisingly progressive about female education. You should hear his private thoughts on the subject. She left him standing among his mythology, another god brought low by miscalculating his prey. The next morning, she found a new contract waiting in her quarters. Standard terms, standard percentage, and a note granting her access to all theatrical events, public and private. She burned the contract after memorizing its contents. Paper trails worked both directions. But the smartest whore in Constantinople was about to learn that contracts meant nothing when the plague came. The sickness arrived on merchant ships, tucked between bolts of silk and hidden in the lungs of sailors. By the time anyone noticed, it had already spread through the harbour districts, where the theatres clustered. Actors started missing performances. Stagehands collapsed during scene changes. The audience thinned as fear overtook lust. Theodora watched the patterns develop with the same attention she'd once applied to senatorial weakness. Disease moved like information, following predictable paths from poor to rich, from desperate to comfortable. Those who could afford to flee did. Those who couldn't died in doorways, their bodies collected each dawn by special crews. The theatres closed by imperial decree. No public gatherings, no performances, no income. Overnight, hundreds of actresses found themselves without purpose or protection. Some turned to begging, others to private arrangements they'd once avoided. The careful ecosystem of Constantinople's entertainment industry collapsed like a bear pit with its walls kicked in. Asterius vanished in the second week, either fled or dead. Without him, the contracts binding the actresses became worthless paper. freedom through catastrophe. The other girls celebrated until they realized freedom meant starvation. But Theodora had been preparing for disaster since the day she'd watched her father die. Her hidden gold could buy food, safety, passage to anywhere. The question was where a 13-year-old prostitute with a ledger full of secrets could possibly go. The answer came from an unexpected source. Narcissus appeared at the theatre's servant entrance on a morning when the death carts were particularly busy. The imperial treasurer looked unchanged by the plague, his court robes immaculate, his expression unreadable. He found Theodora organizing the distribution of her gold among the surviving actresses. "Charity from a whore?" he asked, his voice carrying the cultured tones of palace education. "Investment in future gratitude," she replied, not pausing in her calculations. Each girl received enough to flee or shelter, depending on their choice. Their survival meant potential allies in whatever came next. "I've been reading your work," he said, producing a familiar wax tablet. Her cipher, translated into proper Greek. Her observations from that night with the geese, decoded and annotated. "Your analysis of Senator Hypatius was particularly insightful. You missed 3 tells, but caught 7 I hadn't noticed." She finally looked at him directly. "Are you here to arrest me?" "I'm here to offer you employment. The Emperor needs observers, people who can read rooms, catalogue weaknesses, remember details others miss." He gestured toward the death carts rattling past. "The plague won't last forever. When it ends, power will shift to whoever has the best information about who survived and what they did during the crisis. I'm 13, legally a prostitute. No one of importance would speak freely around me. Which is precisely why you'd be valuable. The invisible see everything." He produced a small leather pouch, heavy with coin. This would buy passage to Alexandria. The Emperor has interests there that require documentation. Alexandria, where the library held all human knowledge, where scholars debated in the streets, where a girl who could read and write might become something other than what the law declared her to be. "What kind of documentation?" Narcissus smiled, the expression sharp as a well-maintained blade. "The governor has been declaring lower tax revenues while his personal wealth mysteriously increases. We need someone to discover where the missing gold flows, someone who could work in his household without suspicion, someone trained to remember everything while appearing to offer only flesh. A spy. He was recruiting her as a spy, not for her body but for the mind she'd sharpened in goose shit and degradation. The irony tasted better than freedom. I'd need a new identity. Letters of introduction. Protection if discovered. Already arranged. You'd travel as part of a theatre company evacuating the plague. Just another actress seeking work in healthier climates." He set the pouch on a crate between them. "The ship leaves at dawn. Your fellow passengers would be other young women of negotiable virtue. No one would question your presence." She weighed gold against possibility. Constantinople was dying, taking its secrets with it, but information was immortal, crossing borders as easily as disease. In Alexandria, she could build new networks, compile new weaknesses, construct a different kind of power from the one that had consumed her mother and sister. Why me? Why not recruit from the palace staff? Because palace servants think like servants. You think like someone who crawled out of the bear pits with systematic intent. His tone carried something that might have been respect. "I've been watching you since that first performance. The geese were irrelevant. What mattered was how you studied us studying you, how you turned exhibition into surveillance." The death carts had filled while they talked, bodies stacked like cordwood, awaiting the mass pyres outside the city walls. Among them she recognized 2 senators from her ledgers, their secrets now worthless as their cooling flesh. But their names would have value in Alexandria, where merchants might want to know which trade routes had lost their protection. "When I return?" she asked, already knowing she would accept. "If you return, it will be as someone else entirely. The plague offers transformation to those who survive it wisely." He turned to leave, then paused. "Burn whatever records you're keeping here. Alexandria will provide better ones." That night, she fed her ledgers to the same brazier that had once warmed the theatre's entrance. Names dissolved into smoke, secrets became ash. 7 years of careful documentation vanished like it had never existed, but the knowledge remained, encoded in memory that had learned to store trauma as data. She kept only one document, sewn into the lining of her traveling cloak. Not a record of sins observed, but a letter she'd written to Anastasia, too young to understand but old enough to remember. Instructions hidden in sisterly affection, warnings dressed as advice, a map to power that didn't require geese or degradation if her baby sister proved smart enough to read between the lines. The ship sailed at dawn, packed with actresses and whores fleeing the plague's embrace. Theodora stood at the rail, watching Constantinople shrink into morning haze. The city that had made her a prostitute at 12 was about to lose its most careful student, but she would return. That much she knew with the certainty of someone who'd memorized every slight, every humiliation, every face that had watched her perform with animals for their amusement. She'd return with different weapons, wearing different masks, carrying secrets that could topple dynasties. The smartest whore in Constantinople was about to vanish into Alexandria's ancient streets, where even emperors had to pay for the right information. And Theodora had learned young that everything, especially transformation, came down to price. The ship from Constantinople had dumped her on Alexandria's docks like spoiled cargo, along with 30 other actresses fleeing the plague. Governor Hetzebolus found her performing in a waterfront tavern where sailors paid in copper coins and watered wine. She danced with scarves that barely covered the bruises from her last client, moving to music that sounded like homesickness. He watched from the shadows for 3 nights before making his offer. A kept woman, his personal entertainer, a villa overlooking the harbour, servants, silk clothing, anything she wanted except freedom. Theodora accepted because winter was coming, and the tavern owner had started charging the girls for heating oil. She was 15 years old. The arrangement lasted 6 months. She discovered his theft gradually, the way infection reveals itself through fever. Missing tax records in his study, gold coins with Syracuse mint marks in drawers where only Constantinople currency should exist, letters in cipher that took her weeks to decode, detailing grain shipments that never appeared on imperial manifests. Hetzebolus was bleeding Alexandria dry, selling its wealth to Sicily while reporting crop failures to the capital. The night she confronted him, wind howled through the villa's corridors like accusations seeking form. She'd arranged the evidence on his desk with the same precision she'd once used to distribute gold among dying actresses. He entered his study drunk on Syrian wine and found her sitting in his chair, wearing nothing but the jewelry he'd given her. His face progressed through confusion, rage, and finally the kind of cold calculation that made governors of frontier provinces. She watched him weigh his options. Murder would require explanation. Accusation would demand proof she might have copied. Negotiation would mean admitting guilt. He chose abandonment. The governor's guards stripped her of everything except the threadbare tunic she'd arrived in. No jewelry, no coins, no sandals. They dumped her outside the city gates as dawn painted the desert the color of dried blood. His last words carried on the wind. Whores who forget their place deserve to remember where they came from. Alexandria's walls rose behind her like a door slamming shut. The desert stretched ahead, endless and unforgiving. Most abandoned women walked into that wasteland and never returned. Their bones joined the sand, their names forgotten before their bodies cooled. Theodora turned east toward the monasteries. The first monk she encountered thought she was a desert demon. He threw holy water that stung her sunburned skin and chanted prayers in Coptic that sounded like cursing. She knelt in the sand and recited the Nicene Creed in perfect Greek. Her voice cracked but clear. The monk stopped mid-exorcism. 3 days without water had carved her face into something skeletal but serene. The sun had burned away everything soft, leaving only the essential architecture of survival. When she finished the creed, she added a passage from John Chrysostom about the redemption of prostitutes. The monk's expression shifted from suspicion to curiosity. The monastery of St. Manas squatted on the desert's edge like a fortress built from prayer and paranoia. 20 monks lived behind its walls, copying manuscripts and cultivating date palms and their own peculiar interpretation of Christianity. They were monophysites, believers that Christ had only one nature, divine rather than human. The Orthodox Church called them heretics. Theodora called them useful. Brother Thomas, the monk who'd tried to exorcise her, became her unlikely advocate. He'd been a rhetoric teacher in Antioch before his conversion, and he recognized educated speech beneath her tavern accent. The abbot agreed to let her shelter in the pilgrims' quarters while she recovered, on the condition that she attend their theological debates. Those debates saved her in ways water and food couldn't touch. The monks argued about the nature of divinity with the passion most men reserved for chariot races. Did Christ have one nature or two? Was Mary the mother of God, or merely the mother of Christ? How could the divine suffer if suffering was inherently human? They dissected scripture like anatomists, finding meanings in prepositions and revelation in verb tenses. Theodora listened from her corner, memorizing not just their arguments but their techniques, how they used authority to overwhelm logic, how they quoted selectively to support predetermined conclusions, how they transformed interpretation into power by claiming divine inspiration for human opinion. After a week, she asked her first question. If Christ's nature is purely divine, how can his suffering redeem human sin? Wouldn't divine suffering be just performance, like an actor pretending to feel what cannot touch him? The room went silent. A woman speaking in theological debate was scandal enough. A prostitute comparing Christ to a theatre performer bordered on blasphemy. Brother Thomas started to apologize for her, but the abbot raised one gnarled hand. "Explain your reasoning, child." She stood, using the posture she'd learned for commanding attention on stage. In the theatre, we perform suffering to evoke emotion in the audience. The pain isn't real, but the response is. If Christ only performed human suffering without truly experiencing it, then the crucifixion becomes cosmic theatre, beautiful, moving, ultimately meaningless. The monks erupted in argument. Some called her analysis heretical. Others found it profound. The abbot watched her with eyes that had seen too many transformations to be easily fooled. When the debate finally exhausted itself, he asked the question that mattered. "What do you want from us?" "To understand power," she said simply. "In Constantinople, I learned how bodies create it. Here, I want to learn how ideas do the same thing." He laughed, the sound like sand scraping across stone. "And what makes you think theology contains power?" "Because emperors execute heretics but negotiate with bishops, because doctrine determines law, because you can make men kill or die by changing their definition of salvation." She met his gaze directly. "The empire runs on two forces, sex and scripture. I've mastered one. Teach me the other." The abbot's name was Severus, and he'd been excommunicated 3 times for refusing to acknowledge Christ's dual nature. Each excommunication had made him more influential among those who questioned orthodoxy. He agreed to let Theodora stay, officially as a pilgrim seeking redemption, actually as an experiment in whether wisdom could grow in corrupted soil. She studied with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that knowledge meant survival. Coptic from the Egyptian monks, Syrian from the pilgrims, Hebrew from stolen moments with texts the church had declared apocryphal, but mostly she studied the architecture of belief itself, how it was constructed, and how it could be demolished. The monastery library contained more than scripture. Hidden among the theological treatises were works of ancient philosophy, medical texts, astronomical observations, books the church discouraged but couldn't quite ban. Theodora read Plato on justice while the monks chanted prayers. She memorized Galen's anatomy while they mortified their flesh. She traced constellation charts while they proclaimed the heavens' divine perfection. Brother Thomas became her primary teacher, partly from pity, mostly from fascination. He'd never encountered a mind that treated learning like revenge. She absorbed languages like a drowning woman gulping air. She dissected arguments with the same precision she'd once applied to senatorial weakness. She asked questions that made him reconsider beliefs he'd held for decades. "Why does the church fear educated women?" she asked one afternoon while copying a passage from Origen. "Because Eve's curiosity destroyed paradise," he replied automatically. "Or because ignorant women are easier to control." She dipped her pen in ink made from desert beetles. The goddess Athena represented wisdom. Mary Magdalene was Christ's most faithful disciple. The oracle at Delphi spoke divine truth. Power feared those women too. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. These were dangerous parallels, but he couldn't deny their logic. The Church teaches that women's nature is inherently weaker, more susceptible to corruption. The Church is run by men who've never touched a woman. What would they know about our nature? She completed the passage in flawless Greek. I've seen more corruption in senators' bedrooms than in all the brothels of Constantinople. Weakness isn't determined by gender. It's determined by who writes the definitions. These conversations would have meant death in Constantinople. But the desert had different rules. Here, heresy was just another form of devotion. The monks prided themselves on beliefs that scandalized Orthodox Christians. Adding a prostitute's perspective to their theological rebellion seemed almost appropriate. But even heretics had limits. The trouble started when pilgrims arrived from Antioch. Among them was a merchant who recognized Theodora from her theatrical days. His whispers spread through the monastery like plague. The actress who'd performed with geese, the whore who'd corrupted Governor Hesebulus, the woman whose name appeared in graffiti on Constantinople's walls. The monks who'd debated theology with her suddenly saw only flesh for sale. The pilgrims who'd shared meals demanded she be expelled before she corrupted their pilgrimage. Even Brother Thomas looked at her differently, his respect curdling into the kind of desire that hated its own existence. Abbot Severus called her to his chamber as sunset bled across the desert. The room smelled of myrrh and disappointment. He gestured to a bench while he remained standing, creating distance between salvation and its failure. "You've learned what you came to learn," he said without preamble. "Scripture, languages, the architecture of belief. Now you must leave." Because of whispers from a merchant who probably cheats his customers and beats his wife. Because your presence has become a test we're failing. His honesty surprised them both. The brothers look at you and see either temptation or proof that redemption is impossible. Neither perspective serves God. She stood, matching his distance with dignity. "And what do you see?" "I see someone who understands power too well to ever be truly faithful. Your questions come from calculation, not conviction. You study scripture the way generals study fortifications, looking for weaknesses." The truth stung more than Exile. She had been using them, just as they'd been using her for the novelty of debating with educated corruption. But she'd learned what she needed. How to speak with religious authority, how to frame desire as doctrine, how to make men believe their impulses were divine inspiration. "Where will you go?" Severus asked, offering a pouch of coins that represented either charity or payment for leaving quietly. "Back to Constantinople, eventually." She took the coins without shame. Pride was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. "But first, I need to practice what you've taught me." "God help whoever you practice on." She smiled then, the expression she'd perfected in theatres and bedrooms and now monastic cells. "God helps those who help themselves. Isn't that what Augustine wrote? He wrote that human will is powerless without divine grace. Then I'll manufacture my own grace. The divine doesn't seem to be offering any." She left that night while the monks sang Compline. The desert received her differently this time. Not as a victim, but as someone who'd learned to navigate wasteland. The stars that had once seemed like judgment now looked like navigation. Direction for someone who'd discovered that transformation required more than just changing location. But she wasn't returning to Constantinople. Not yet. First came Antioch, where she could test her new knowledge on audiences who didn't know her history, where she could build a different kind of reputation using the tools Severus and his heretics had unknowingly provided. She'd entered the desert as a discarded whore. She was leaving as something far more dangerous. A woman who could quote scripture while calculating weakness, who could debate theology while planning seduction, who could make blasphemy sound like blessing. The monks had taught her their greatest secret without meaning to. That power wasn't in the words of scripture, but in who got to interpret them. That orthodoxy was just heresy that won. That faith itself could be performed as convincingly as suffering, and most people couldn't tell the difference. In Antioch, she would become a wool spinner, a respectable profession that explained soft hands and would place her in wealthy households where information flowed as freely as thread. She would quote scripture to matrons while cataloguing their husbands' secrets. She would attend church while building networks among the servants who saw everything but were seen by no one. The desert fell away behind her like a costume she no longer needed. Ahead waited cities full of men who confused piety with power, who thought quoting Paul made their prejudices sacred. They wouldn't recognize the weapon walking toward them, dressed in humility and speaking fluent theology, because the virgin Emperor Justinian was about to meet his match, and he'd never touched a woman in his life. Justinian's fingers trembled against the parchment as Theodora explained the monophysite position on Christ's nature. She sat 3 feet away in the wool spinner's shop, close enough that he could smell the lanolin on her hands, far enough to maintain propriety. The future emperor of Byzantium, 40 years old and untouched by any woman, found himself leaning forward to catch every word from the 22-year-old former prostitute who spoke theology like poetry. She'd orchestrated their meeting with the precision of a general planning siege warfare. 3 months of establishing herself in Constantinople's textile district. 2 months of attending the same church where Justinian heard morning mass. 1 month of theological discussions with the deacons, who mentioned the brilliant young woman who could quote Origen in Greek and Augustine in Latin. The trap snapped shut the moment he entered the shop seeking wool for monastery donations. His virgin awkwardness made him an easier mark than the senators she'd once catalogued. When she reached for a skein of wool, her fingers brushed his hand accidentally. He jerked back as if burned, then apologized for his reaction, then apologized for apologizing. The most powerful man in Constantinople after the emperor himself couldn't form coherent sentences around a woman who'd once performed naked with geese. She pretended not to notice his discomfort while calibrating her approach. No overt sexuality that would trigger his monastic defenses. Instead, she deployed intelligence like a weapon, discussing the finer points of Chalcedonian doctrine, while her presence itself became the seduction. Every gesture calculated. Every word chosen to bypass his intellectual guards and strike directly at desires he'd spent 4 decades denying. The wool shop's owner, a widow named Helena who owed Theodora 3 favors, found reasons to leave them alone. The afternoon light slanted through wooden shutters, casting bars of gold across the floor. Dust motes danced in the air like tiny prayers. Theodora spun thread while spinning conversation, her hands steady as her voice wove through theological complexities that made Justinian's breath catch. The Council of Chalcedon created more problems than it solved, she said, her tone suggesting academic interest rather than heretical conviction. How can Christ be fully human and fully divine, without one nature corrupting the other? Justinian's response came out strangled. His expertise in law and theology, the intellectual armor he wore against the world, crumbled under her focused attention. She listened to his explanations with the intensity of someone discovering revelation. Her questions pushed him toward conclusions he'd never considered. Her agreement felt like validation from God himself. 3 visits became 5. 5 became 10. He started arriving at the wool shop at specific times, carrying books he thought she'd appreciate. She read them overnight and returned them with marginal notes that made him reconsider passages he'd memorized decades ago. Their debates grew longer. The space between them grew shorter. Helena stopped bothering to stay in the room. The Virgin Emperor's nephew was falling in love with an idea dressed in flesh. Theodora represented everything his disciplined life had rejected: passion disguised as piety, desire wrapped in doctrine, a mind that challenged him paired with a body that terrified him. She was the theological debate he'd always wanted, and the temptation he'd always fled, combined in one devastating package. But legal barriers stood between them, like walls built from centuries of precedent. Constantine's ancient laws declared that senators couldn't marry actresses. The classification followed women like Theodora forever, a scarlet letter written in jurisprudence. Even if she never performed again, even if she lived as chastely as a nun, the law saw only what she had been: prostitute, actress, untouchable by respectable men. Justinian discovered these restrictions while researching precedents for something he couldn't quite admit he was considering. His legal manuscripts mocked him with their clarity. No senator could marry anyone who had ever performed on stage. No exceptions. No loopholes. No hope for the virgin lawyer who found himself thinking about a reformed prostitute during evening prayers. He mentioned the law during one of their discussions, framing it as an intellectual exercise. The restrictions seem unusually harsh, he said, not meeting her eyes. A woman's past becomes her eternal present. No redemption recognized by civil code. Theodora's hands never paused in their spinning. Laws reflect the men who write them. Perhaps when different men hold the pen, different laws will follow. She looked at him directly then, her gaze holding meanings that made his celibate heart race. After all, even Augustus revised marriage legislation when it suited his purposes. The suggestion hung between them like incense. Change the law, rewrite the rules, make the impossible legal through imperial decree. But such changes required power Justinian didn't yet possess. His uncle Justin wore the purple, and Justin's wife Euphemia guarded traditional values like a dragon hoarding gold. Euphemia had risen from slavery to empress, but elevation hadn't softened her stance on propriety. Former slaves often proved the harshest judges of impropriety, as if strictness could erase their own irregular origins. She'd heard whispers about her nephew's visits to the wool shop. Her spies reported theological discussions that lasted hours. Her instincts, sharpened by palace survival, sensed danger in the brilliant young woman who made Justinian forget 40 years of celibacy. The empress summoned Theodora on a Tuesday that smelled like rain. The palace's formal reception hall dwarfed the two women, making their confrontation seem simultaneously intimate and theatrical. Euphemia wore purple silk that proclaimed her power. Theodora wore undyed wool that suggested humility. The contrast fooled neither of them. "You discuss theology with my nephew," Euphemia said without preamble. "Power didn't require politeness." "His Excellency honors me with his insights into Scripture," Theodora replied, each word measured, weighted, deployed. "His Excellency is a brilliant fool who thinks intelligence equals wisdom." The Empress moved closer, her presence filling space like smoke. "I know what you are, what you were, what you're attempting to become." Silence stretched between them. Theodora recognized the tactic from her theatrical days. Create emptiness that demanded filling. Wait for your opponent to reveal themselves through nervous speech. But she'd learned patience in the desert, where silence was survival. She waited. Euphemia's jaw tightened. "Leave Constantinople. Tonight. I'll provide gold for passage anywhere. Alexandria, Antioch, even Rome if you prefer. Simply leave. And if I prefer to stay? Then you'll discover how many ways an empress can destroy a wool spinner. Your shop will burn from mysterious fires. Your customers will find other suppliers. Your theological discussions will be interrupted by guards investigating heresy." Euphemia smiled then, the expression sharp as shattered pottery. "I survived palace slavery by understanding power. Don't make me demonstrate those lessons." Theodora performed a curtsy that belonged in throne rooms, not wool shops. "Your Majesty's concern for her nephew touches my heart, but perhaps she misunderstands the situation. His Excellency seeks only spiritual discourse. I provide only intellectual companionship. Neither violates law or propriety. You think me stupid because I was born in chains?" Euphemia's voice dropped to whisper. "I see your game, girl, making him need you, creating an addiction to your presence, waiting for opportunity to strike." She leaned forward, close enough that Theodora could smell the myrrh in her hair. "But I won't live forever. Neither will my husband. And when we die, when Justinian takes the throne, you think he'll change laws for you, make you respectable, crown the whore of Constantinople?" The accusation hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Theodora met the Empress's gaze without flinching. "If I wanted mere respectability, Your Majesty, I'd have stayed in Alexandria with the governor. If I wanted a crown, I'd have targeted younger men with fewer scruples." She let her voice carry the weight of truth. "What I want is something Your Majesty should understand. Transformation. Not just of status, but of possibility itself." "Transformation." Euphemia tasted the word like poison. "You mean power." "I mean the chance to be more than what birth declared me. Surely a former slave understands that hunger." The Empress straightened, her face becoming mask. "I understand it. I also understand its cost. The men who must die, the women who must disappear, the principles that must be strangled in their sleep." Her eyes held memories darker than any theatre's backdrop. Are you prepared for that price, little actress? When transformation demands you become the monster they always said you were. Theodora smiled then, the expression she'd worn while geese pecked grain from her flesh. Your Majesty assumes I haven't already paid it. The meeting ended without resolution. Euphemia couldn't exile someone guilty only of conversation. Theodora couldn't advance while the Empress lived. They parted like duelists, acknowledging a draw, each planning their next assault. But flesh had its own timeline. Within a month, Euphemia's health began failing. Palace physicians whispered about stomach pains, bloody flux, symptoms that suggested poison but could equally indicate disease. Theodora maintained perfect alibis for every suspicious meal, every questioned cup of wine. She spent Euphemia's illness in full view at the wool shop, spinning thread while an empire held its breath. Justinian attended his aunt constantly, watching her fade like purple dye in harsh sunlight. She clutched his hand with fingers gone skeletal, trying to press warnings through her grip. But pain stole coherent words. She died trying to name a danger she could feel but not prove, her last breath carrying fragments of accusations that made no sense to anyone but her nephew. He mourned with the distraction of someone processing multiple losses. His aunt, his certainty, his carefully constructed barriers against desire. Theodora waited 3 months before accepting his renewed visits, long enough for grief to ferment into need for comfort. She offered theological discussions that somehow eased his pain, understanding that felt like absolution, presence that made palace emptiness bearable. The law still stood between them, but laws were just words on parchment, and Justinian had spent his life learning how words could be reshaped. He began drafting legislation in private, documents that would revolutionize marriage restrictions, not just for himself but for all citizens limited by ancient prejudices. If personal desire happened to align with legal reform, who could question such coincidence? Meanwhile, Theodora cultivated allies among the palace women, servants who brought gossip with their wool purchases, secretaries' wives who appreciated her theological insights, even Antonina, wife of the general Belisarius, who recognized a kindred spirit in strategic brilliance. Networks grew like vines, wrapping around power structures, waiting to bloom when conditions proved favorable. Justin's health declined as his nephew's influence rose. The emperor who'd bought his throne with German gold was fading, leaving Justinian to manage the empire's daily operations. With executive power came executive privilege. Draft legislation became proposed law. Proposed law became imperial decree. The transformation happened so gradually that most senators didn't realize they were witnessing legal revolution until it was complete. On April 1st, 523, Justinian published Novel 22, the law that had defined actresses as permanent prostitutes, unfit for respectable marriage, simply ceased to exist. In its place rose legislation declaring that any woman who abandoned the stage and lived respectably could marry anyone, including senators. The past no longer imprisoned the future. Transformation became legally possible. But possibility and permission weren't the same thing. Justinian still had to act on the freedom he'd created. The virgin emperor who'd spent 4 decades avoiding female touch now faced the terrifying prospect of actual courtship. He approached romance like a legal brief, with careful documentation and extensive precedent. Theodora accepted his fumbling advances with patience that disguised calculation. Their wedding took place in 525, 2 years after the law changed. By then, she transformed from wool spinner to theological advisor to indispensable presence in Justinian's life. The ceremony was small, private, witnessed only by those who understood they were watching history pivot. The virgin emperor married the reformed prostitute while Constantinople slept, unaware that its future had just changed hands. But consummation required more than legal documentation. Justinian approached their wedding night like a man facing execution. 45 years of celibacy had built walls that simple desire couldn't breach. He sat on their marriage bed fully clothed, quoting Paul's letters about flesh and spirit while sweat beaded on his forehead. Theodora had spent 20 years mastering the art of reading men's needs. She recognized that conventional seduction would shatter him. Instead, she deployed the weapons that had won their war: intelligence, theology, Careful revelation of skin wrapped in scriptural justification. She made consummation feel like communion, transforming physical surrender into spiritual victory. By dawn, the Virgin Emperor understood what 4 decades of discipline had denied him. But more importantly, Theodora understood him, his needs, his weaknesses, the exact pressure points where intellect failed and flesh commanded. She'd spent 2 years studying his mind. Now she possessed the map to his body, power more intimate than any crown. Within a year, Justin died and Justinian ascended to the purple. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Real power wore Theodora's face. The girl who'd performed with geese now commanded the Byzantine Empire through the man who thought he'd conquered her. The greatest seduction in Constantinople's history was complete. But ruling through a husband's desire was still just another kind of performance. What followed would transform Constantinople into Theodora's personal stage. The architect's hands shook as he unrolled the blueprints across Theodora's desk. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. These weren't normal palace modifications. The specifications made his stomach turn. "The purple room requires 60 feet of polished bronze mirrors," he read aloud, voice cracking, "mounted at angles calculated for maximum visibility from the central platform." Theodora traced the design with one manicured finger. The mirrors must be adjustable, mechanical hinges, silent operation. Her voice carried the same calm she used for discussing grain imports. "I want observers to see everything, every angle, every response." The architect swallowed hard. The room's dimensions matched no standard palace chamber. Octagonal walls, domed ceiling with concealed apertures, heating channels beneath marble floors that could warm specific zones to precise temperatures. His professional mind recognized brilliance. His human conscience screamed warnings. "The 7 pools," she continued, pointing to the adjoining complex. "Each one different depth, different temperature, connected by underground channels that can be sealed or opened remotely." He designed bathhouses for senators. This was something else entirely. The pool specifications included restraint points disguised as decorative elements, overflow channels leading to chambers below, acoustic modifications that would carry sound in specific directions, architecture designed not for bathing but for breaking. "Your Majesty," the structural requirements alone. He grasped for excuses that wouldn't reveal his horror. "Cost is irrelevant. Timeline is not." She rolled up the blueprints with practiced efficiency. "Construction begins tonight. Select workers who understand discretion." The architect knew what that meant. Foreign slaves, men who spoke no Greek, workers who would vanish when construction finished, their knowledge buried with their bodies. He'd built for powerful people before, never for appetites this precisely engineered. "The sound channels concern me," he ventured carefully. "If voices can travel from the pools to the observation chambers, then design them properly." Her smile reminded him that empresses didn't make requests. "Every word spoken in those waters should reach my archives. Every gasp, every confession, every plea." The palace had always contained secret passages. Any structure housing paranoid emperors developed hidden routes naturally. But Theodora's modifications went beyond standard surveillance. She was building a machine for manufacturing secrets. Architecture that would extract truth through carefully calibrated suffering. Within weeks, construction sounds echoed through palace nights. Official proclamations spoke of renovation, of modernizing ancient structures. The court assumed Theodora was indulging architectural vanity. They couldn't imagine the precision being applied to their future degradation. The architect worked with mounting dread. Each specification revealed deeper perversion. Walls that could become transparent from one side, floors with hidden panels for introducing elements, ceiling mechanisms for suspension. Every surface designed to facilitate activities he couldn't name without vomiting. But the pools disturbed him most. 7 circular basins arranged like constellation points, each one's depth calculated to keep occupants at specific heights. Water heated by underground furnaces to temperatures that would weaken but not kill. Marble edges polished smooth except for carefully placed rough sections that would scrape skin seeking escape. "Why 7?" he asked during one inspection. immediately regretting the question. Theodora stood at the central pool's edge, testing water temperature with her fingertips. 7 deadly sins, 7 requires choices. Force's ranking of desperation. She smiled at his expression. Don't worry, architect. You're building confession chambers. The Byzantine Empire's sins require proper accommodation. The workers installing mirror arrays whispered prayers in languages he didn't recognize. They'd seen their own reflections multiplied into infinity, realized what activities these angles would display. Some tried to position mirrors badly, introducing blind spots from mercy or revulsion. Theodora noticed every deviation. Workers who showed conscience disappeared. Replacements arrived who installed bronze with dead eyes. Sound channels proved the greatest challenge. Standard acoustic design amplified everything equally. Theodora demanded selective transmission. Certain frequencies emphasized, others dampened. The purple room needed to hear gasps but not screams, whispers but not shouting, architecture that would force specific vocalizations. Test it, she ordered, when construction neared completion. The architect brought trained singers, explaining they could demonstrate acoustic properties. Theodora laughed, the sound echoing through empty pools like prophecy. Singers perform. I need authentic sound. She gestured to her guards. Bring servants. Various ages. Both sexes. Tell them nothing. What followed? Made the architect bite through his own tongue. Servants ordered into pools at different depths, commanded to speak, then whisper, then make other sounds as guards provided motivation. Theodora sat in the observation chamber, eyes closed, listening to terror transmit through stone channels, making notes, demanding adjustments. The third pool distorts male voices, she observed clinically. Lower the water level 3 inches, and the overflow channels need silencing. I want to hear submission, not splashing. By winter, the complex neared completion. The architect had aged decades in months. His hair went white. His hands developed tremors that wine couldn't steady. He'd built something that would outlive its purpose. Architecture that would remain when flesh rotted. Future emperors would inherit chambers designed for appetites they couldn't imagine. The Purple Room's inauguration required special preparation. Theodora selected servants with specific characteristics. Physical beauty, marred by interesting flaws. Intelligence dampened by fear. Loyalty enforced by family held hostage. They would operate her architectural innovation, learning its mechanisms through use. Your masterpiece, she told the architect during final inspection. Bronze mirrors reflected them into infinite regression. Pool water lapped at marble edges with sounds like hunger. You should be proud. Few men build their nightmares with such precision. He tried to speak but found his voice gone. Not from emotion, from physical inability. The wine she'd served contained compounds that destroyed vocal cords. A temporary condition, she assured him, lasting only months, long enough to ensure silence about specifications. He'd designed chambers for extracting secrets. Now architecture itself had stolen his ability to share them. Don't look so horrified, Theodora said, patting his cheek with mock affection. You'll recover, eventually. Consider it payment for immortality. Your design will outlive us all. The architect stumbled from the palace, clutching his throat. Behind him, servants began their training, learning to operate mechanisms, memorizing acoustic sweet spots, practicing discretion that would preserve their lives. The Purple Room waited like a mouth, ready to swallow Constantinople's elite. But chambers designed for individual degradation weren't enough. Theodora needed volume. The empire contained thousands who required processing. Secret sins existed at every social level. Architecture for appetites required industrial scale. The solution came from unexpected sources. Harbour warehouses abandoned during plague. Garrison buildings left empty by military restructuring. Structures scattered throughout Constantinople that could be repurposed without attracting attention. Connected by underground passages that already existed, remnants of aqueducts and siege preparations. She assigned different architects to each site. None knew about the others. Each believed they were designing unique facilities for imperial use. Bathhouses for visiting dignitaries. reception halls for foreign merchants, therapeutic centers for treating plague survivors, innocent purposes that explained unusual modifications. Only Theodora understood the network forming. 7 major sites throughout the city, 49 smaller facilities in strategic neighborhoods, each one containing elements from the Purple Room's design: pools, mirrors, sound channels, mechanisms for managing flesh on industrial scale, Constantinople itself transforming into architecture for appetites. The servants operating these facilities required special preparation. Theodora selected them from plague orphans, children young enough to train, old enough to understand consequences. She had their tongues cut professionally, ensuring they could work but never speak, their silence guaranteed by surgery rather than loyalty. These muted servants became extensions of architecture itself, moving through hidden passages, operating mechanisms, recording everything while revealing nothing. They developed their own sign language, complex enough for operational communication, limited enough to prevent conspiracy. Hands that spoke only Theodora's will. Some historians would later claim she murdered these servants regularly, replacing them as they learned too much. The truth was worse. She kept them alive for decades, their knowledge making them irreplaceable. Muted witnesses to appetites that would have driven speaking servants insane. Their silence became its own torture, memories with no outlet except the architecture they operated. The Purple Room's first official use came during a feast celebrating military victories. Theodora invited select senators, their wives carefully excluded. Wine flowed freely, laced with compounds that lowered inhibition without causing obvious intoxication. As the evening progressed, she suggested entertainment in her new facilities. What happened next would become Constantinople legend, whispered but never documented. Senators discovering chambers designed to expose desires they'd hidden for decades. Mirrors reflecting activities that would end careers if revealed. Water at temperatures that made resistance dissolve. Architecture accomplishing what torture couldn't. Voluntary degradation. By dawn, Theodora owned 7 senators completely. Not through force, but through engineering spaces where they'd revealed themselves. The Purple Room had recorded everything. Sound channels preserving confessions, hidden observers documenting positions, architecture itself becoming blackmail. But individual corruption wasn't the goal. Theodora envisioned systematic transformation. Every powerful man in Constantinople processed through her facilities. Every secret extracted through careful application of space and suggestion. The empire's elite becoming puppets, their strings woven from shame only she could release. The architect who'd built the Purple Room died 3 months after recovering his voice. Suicide, the official record stated. He'd thrown himself from the Galata Tower, leaving a note that said only, "I built hell." His assistants disappeared over following weeks. Accidents, sudden illnesses, the knowledge of Theodora's architectural innovation dying with its creators. But the rooms themselves remained, waiting, hungry, architecture for appetites that would outlive its empress. Because Theodora wasn't just building pleasure chambers, the UTHE was constructing a human procurement pipeline that would reach across the empire. The purple dove tattoo covered no more than a child's thumbnail, nested in the hollow where shoulder met neck. Servants learned to check for it when new staff arrived at noble households. Kitchen girls, chamber attendants, boys who carried wine, all bearing that same small mark, delicate as a birthmark, until you knew what it meant. The children arrived at Constantinople's orphanages in steady streams, war orphans from the Persian frontier, plague survivors with no remaining family, abandoned infants left at monastery gates. The city's charitable institutions overflowed with young bodies requiring care, and Theodora's agents moved among them like fishermen selecting catch. They looked for specific qualities: intelligence that showed in quick eyes, beauty that would ripen with proper feeding. Most importantly, isolation complete enough that no one would search when they vanished. The selection process took months of observation, watchers posing as donors, servants who reported promising candidates, a network designed to identify raw material for careful cultivation. The chosen ones disappeared during routine transfers between institutions. Official records showing adoption by wealthy families seeking household servants. Perfectly legal, properly documented. The Purple Dove School's enrollment ledgers would never surface in any imperial audit. The children simply moved from one form of salvation to another. The school occupied a compound near the Blackmail district, disguised as a textile workshop. High walls suggested industrial privacy. Guard posts explained by valuable materials inside. Even the neighbors believed young workers there learned weaving and embroidery. The screams that sometimes escaped could be attributed to industrial accidents, fingers caught in looms, needles finding flesh instead of fabric. Inside those walls, transformation followed careful stages. First came the physical preparation, proper feeding to enhance natural beauty, baths in water mixed with oils that soften skin, hair treatments using Persian techniques, bodies sculpted through specific exercises. The youngest was 6. The oldest never exceeded 14, ages when flesh could still be molded like warm wax. But bodily modification was just foundation. The real training focused on skills no normal servant would need. They learned to read not just Greek but Latin, Syrian, Armenian, mathematics beyond household accounting, memory techniques borrowed from theatrical training, how to recall conversations verbatim after hearing them once, how to document activities without appearing to observe, silent note-taking using abbreviated symbols, information gathering disguised as domestic service. The dormitories held 20 children each, boys and girls separated by corridors but united in purpose. They woke before dawn for lessons, languages until noon, physical conditioning after lunch, specialized instruction through evening. The schedule allowed no leisure, no friendships, no identity beyond their designated function. Sister Agatha oversaw the girls' education, never her real name. Former actress who'd aged out of performance but retained theatrical precision. She taught them to move like servants while thinking like spies, how to be invisible in plain sight, how to position themselves where conversations happened, how to ask questions that sounded like small talk but extracted confession. Brother Marcus handled the boys with similar expertise. Another carefully selected instructor, former military intelligence officer who'd lost position through political miscalculation. He understood how young men could access spaces women couldn't, taught them to project harmlessness while memorizing defensive weaknesses, trained them to serve wine while calculating poison dosages. The purple dove tattoo came only after 2 years of preparation. Needles dipped in special ink that would never fade. Marks small enough to hide but distinctive enough for recognition. The ceremony happened at night. Children lined up, while instructors explained the honor they were receiving. Selection for special service. Elevation beyond common servitude. The pain was privilege. Those who cried during marking were removed from the program. Weakness at the needle predicted weakness in service. The failures were sold to regular households, good servants with excellent training. Nothing suspicious. Nothing special, just orphans who'd found respectable employment. The Purple Dove recipients moved to advanced instruction, lessons in their true purpose. Sexual education began gradually, anatomical drawings presented as medical knowledge, discussions of reproduction framed as biological study. They learned names for acts most adults couldn't pronounce, studied techniques from Indian texts the church had banned, understood their bodies as instruments requiring proper tuning. By age 12, they possessed theoretical knowledge that would have horrified married women twice their age. Practical application came later. Selected students brought to special chambers, paired with instructors who demonstrated rather than described. No violence, no force. Careful introduction to activities they would facilitate or endure. The emphasis on emotional distance. Physical participation without psychological involvement. Their bodies serving purposes while their minds recorded data. The school's graduates emerged perfectly trained, beautiful servants who spoke multiple languages, efficient workers who anticipated needs, young people grateful for rescue from orphanages, their purple dove marks hidden beneath clothing, their true purpose invisible to employers who thought they'd simply hired exceptional staff. Placement followed careful strategy. each graduate assigned to households Theodora needed to monitor. Senators with questionable loyalty, merchants suspected of smuggling, priests whose public piety masked private corruptions, foreign ambassadors requiring surveillance. The purple doves spread through Constantinople's elite, like precisely placed infections. They wrote weekly reports in cipher, used dead drops throughout the city, met handlers in markets and bathhouses. Information flowed from bedrooms to archives, pillow talk transcribed, private conversations documented, sexual preferences catalogued, financial indiscretions recorded. Each purple dove a tiny camera in Theodora's expanding surveillance network. Some graduates received special assignments, placement in households where simple observation wasn't enough, where active participation in corruption would yield better intelligence. These advanced operatives learned to seduce without appearing forward, to become indispensable to masters who never suspected manipulation, to create the secrets they would later report. The procurement system extended beyond Constantinople. Ships carried purple doves to Alexandria, Antioch, even Rome. Anywhere Byzantine interests required monitoring, they integrated into foreign households, learned local customs, adapted their training to different cultures. The network grew like vine, wrapping around power structures throughout the Mediterranean. Merchants believed they were trafficking exotic oils and rare textiles. Ship manifests listed cargo that matched weight and volume. Customs officials inspected containers that seemed to hold exactly what documentation claimed. Hidden compartments built with architectural precision. Air holes disguised as decorative elements. Children trained to remain silent during transport. The purple dove distribution network operated in plain sight. Supply chains reached into territories beyond imperial borders. Persian orphans acquired through intermediaries. Gothic children purchased from tribal leaders. Even Saxon youth from distant Britain. The school processed all nationalities, taught them Greek perfection, molded them into Byzantine instruments. Their diverse origins became advantages. Servants who could genuinely claim foreign birth. Native speakers of languages Theodora needed translated. But not all purple doves were destined for simple household service. The most talented graduates were reserved for special appointments, personal attendants to Theodora herself, operators of the architectural innovations spreading through Constantinople, specialists in activities that required particular training. These elite servants wore their purple doves with pride, understanding they'd been selected for the Empress's direct service. The school's existence remained hidden through careful management. Instructors rotated regularly, never staying long enough to develop dangerous loyalties. Students who failed or rebelled simply disappeared. Bodies processed through the same channels that handled palace waste. Families told their adopted children had died from sudden illness. Tragic, but common in Byzantine times. Financial records were laundered through legitimate businesses. The textile workshop actually produced cloth, fine materials that sold in markets, profits that explained expenditures. Imperial auditors found nothing suspicious, just another successful enterprise in Constantinople's commercial districts. The children working there were learning valuable trades, contributing to the empire's prosperity. Local authorities received regular bribes disguised as charitable donations. Inspections were scheduled in advance. Problematic officials were reassigned to distant provinces. The Purple Dove School operated with the same legal protection as imperial facilities, because, in practice, it was an essential component of Theodora's intelligence apparatus. 20 years of operation produced thousands of graduates, each one bearing the small tattoo, each one placed strategically throughout the empire. Some rose to positions of genuine authority, trusted servants who managed households, personal attendants who controlled access to powerful men. A few even married into minor nobility, purple doves, whose children would carry their training into new generations. The network's true scope was known only to Theodora and her closest administrators. Even Justinian remained unaware of its extent. He knew his wife maintained informants, every ruler did, but the systematic recruitment and training of child spies exceeded his imagination. The Purple Dove School was Theodora's private project, funded through her personal accounts, managed by her hand-picked agents. Files on every graduate were maintained in the palace archives, their locations, their assignments, their reports, cross-referenced and catalogued, a human database that could be activated when needed. Purple doves who'd served quietly for years could be triggered into action, sleeper agents awaiting orders that might never come, or might arrive tomorrow. The system's greatest success was its invisibility. Senators boasted about their exceptional servants, merchants praised their multilingual assistants, priests appreciated attendants who understood theological nuances, none suspected they were praising their own surveillance. The purple doves had become integral to elite society, too valuable to question, too useful to investigate. But Senator Focus broke the pattern. His new chamber attendant was beautiful, trained, properly respectful. She wore silk scarves that concealed her neck, claimed sensitivity to cold that required coverage. Focus thought nothing of it, until the night he discovered her writing. Not household accounts, not shopping lists, names and dates in cipher he couldn't read but recognized as dangerous. He grabbed her throat in rage. Silk tore away. The purple dove emerged like accusation, small and perfect and damning. Focus had participated in activities the church condemned. His preferences were specifically illegal. This servant had witnessed everything, recorded it all. One girl's testimony could destroy him. The smart response would have been negotiation, perhaps recruitment as double agent, maybe quiet elimination with careful cover story. But Focus let anger override wisdom. He couldn't kill one purple dove without investigation, but he could threaten the system that produced her, blackmail the Empress who'd placed spies in his bedroom, use his knowledge to extract concessions. He composed a letter that night, careful wording that revealed his discovery without admitting his crimes, demanded meeting with Theodora, threatened exposure of her network unless terms were discussed. The purple dove delivered it herself, trembling but obedient, training overcoming terror. Her life was forfeit either way. At least this path served her Empress. Theodora read the letter while soaking in her private bath. Scented water lapped at marble edges. Steam rose like incense. Her expression never changed. She'd anticipated this moment for 20 years. Someone would eventually discover the purple doves, react badly, attempt crude leverage. The only surprise was it had taken this long. She summoned her architects, not for construction but for demonstration. The Purple Room had operated successfully for years, processing individual senators through careful degradation, but tonight would showcase its full potential. Senator Focus would learn why challenging an empress with unlimited architectural resources was foolish, even fatal. The invitation came wrapped in purple silk. A private dinner, just the senator and empress, to discuss his concerns reasonably, find mutually beneficial solutions. Focus read accommodation in every line. His threats had worked. Theodora would negotiate rather than risk exposure. He dressed in his finest toga, prepared arguments for maximum advantage. The purple dove who'd served him was waiting at the palace entrance, still wearing torn silk around her throat, still trembling. She led him through corridors he'd never seen, past guards who avoided eye contact, downstairs that descended beyond basement levels. The air grew thick with frankincense and something else, something that made his skin prickle with recognition of danger arriving too late. The door to the Purple Room opened silently. Mirrors reflected Senator into infinity. Pools waited with water at perfect temperatures. Mechanisms gleamed in bronze efficiency. And Theodora sat on the central platform, wearing purple that made her skin look carved from ivory. "Senator," she said, gesturing to cushions beside her, "let's discuss your blackmail attempt, and why you should never have tried to blackmail an empress who had spent 20 years perfecting revenge." The wine tasted slightly bitter, but Senator Focus drank it anyway. 3 hours later, he could feel everything but move nothing. His fingers lay dead against silk cushions. His legs refused commands. Even his eyelids had frozen open, forcing him to watch bronze mirrors multiply his helplessness into infinite reflections. Theodora circled him slowly, her purple robes rustling against marble floors. She held a silver chalice, swirling its contents with practiced ease. The frankincense burning in corner braziers couldn't mask the acrid smell rising from hidden vents. Something chemical, something designed. "Paralysis fascinates me," she said, her voice carrying the academic interest of a natural philosopher. "The mind remains perfectly alert while the body becomes architecture, rigid, structural, unable to participate in its own experience." Focus tried to speak. His throat produced only a whistle of air. The compound in his wine had been precisely measured, enough to freeze voluntary movement, not enough to stop breathing. The distinction mattered when punishment required consciousness. She set down the chalice and produced a thin blade, not for cutting, for demonstration. She pressed its point against his palm, just hard enough to dimple skin. His nerves screamed information his muscles couldn't answer. The sensation built in layers. First pressure, then pain, then something worse as she traced patterns across his lifeless hand. "Your letter mentioned exposure, threatening to reveal my surveillance network to the Senate." She moved the blade to his wrist, finding the pulse that hammered uselessly against paralyzed vessels. "You thought knowledge gave you power, but power isn't knowing secrets. Power is designing the consequences for those who try to use them." The door opened silently. Two figures entered, their faces obscured by theatrical masks. They wheeled a table, bearing instruments Focus recognized from anatomical demonstrations. Tools for education, tools for exposure, tools that would reveal how bodies worked by taking them carefully apart. But Theodora had refined torture beyond crude butchery. The figures began with sensation rather than surgery. Feathers drawn across skin that couldn't flinch. Ice pressed against nerves that couldn't retreat. Heat applied in patterns that would have made him writhe if writhing were possible. His paralyzed body became a map of involuntary response. "The fascinating thing about paralysis," Theodora continued, watching his pupils dilate with each new sensation, "is how it amplifies rather than diminishes experience. Unable to move away, the mind focuses completely on input. Every nerve ending becomes a universe of information." She gestured to the pools visible through archways. Steam rose from water heated to different temperatures, each one designed for specific effects. But Focus wouldn't be experiencing them. Not yet. First came understanding through observation. The masked figures brought in another senator, Macedonia, who'd enriched himself selling citizenship documents. He walked willingly, unaware of his colleague's frozen presence. The purple dove at his side had delivered an invitation he couldn't refuse. Private audience with the Empress. Exclusive entertainment in her legendary facilities. Macedonia's eagerness curdled into confusion when he saw Focus. The rigid posture, the staring eyes, the instruments arrayed like an anatomy lesson waiting for its subject. He started to speak, then noticed how Focus's chest rose and fell without any other movement. Paralyzed but breathing, aware but helpless. "Senator Macedonia," Theodora said warmly, "thank you for accepting my invitation. Your colleague is enjoying a new form of entertainment, complete sensory experience without the distraction of movement." The masked figures moved too quickly for resistance. One moment Macedonia stood uncertain. The next, cups pressed against his lips. Different compounds than Focus had consumed. These worked selectively. His legs remained mobile. His arms could gesture, but specific nerves went dead with surgical precision. Fascinating what modern alchemy can achieve, Theodora observed as Macedonia discovered his new limitations. You can walk, reach, perform most activities, but certain sensations have simply ceased to exist. She produced a pin, dragged it across Macedonia's palm. He watched without feeling. The visual input arrived, but neural response had been severed. She pressed harder. Blood welled from the scratch. Still nothing. His face cycled through confusion, fear, and horrible understanding. Touch is gone. Pain has vanished. But other senses remain perfectly functional. She snapped her fingers near his ear. He flinched at the sound. You can hear your own flesh tearing, see wounds opening, smell blood flowing. But feeling? That privilege has been revoked. The demonstration escalated with theatrical precision. Masked figures led Macedonia to mirrors where he could observe procedures he couldn't feel, small cuts that looked devastating but registered as nothing. His mind knew damage was occurring. His body reported emptiness. The disconnect created its own form of suffering. Focus watched everything, wanted to close his eyes. Couldn't. The paralysis that trapped him also forced witness. He understood now why Theodora had chosen this specific punishment. Not just for his body, but for his observation, seeing variations, understanding possibilities, knowing similar innovations awaited him. Every senator who's betrayed imperial trust deserves personalized attention, Theodora said, moving between her two guests. Focus threatened exposure, so he experiences complete openness, unable to hide even behind closed eyelids. Macedonia sold documentation, so he loses the ability to document sensation. Justice, with architectural precision. The pools began to serve their purpose. Macedonia was guided to the first one, water at perfect bath temperature that he experienced as visual information only. He could see his skin reddening, watch steam rise from his submerged limbs, but the warmth that should have accompanied immersion simply didn't exist. The mind struggles when senses fragment, Theodora explained. It tries to construct experience from partial data, invents sensations to fill the gaps. But invention isn't reality. Eventually, the disconnect becomes its own torture. She turned back to focus, studying his frozen features, reading the horror accumulating behind paralyzed eyes. Your punishment is different, but complementary. He loses sensation while retaining movement. You keep sensation while losing control. Both of you learning that challenging imperial authority requires architectural response. The chamber's acoustics had been designed for this moment. Every sound amplified and directed. Focus heard Macedonia's breathing quicken. The splash of water he couldn't feel. The whisper of fabric against numb skin. Audio testimony to experiences his colleague's body couldn't confirm. Theodora's personal servants entered carrying ledgers, not the purple doves who'd revealed themselves. Different attendants, older, bearing scars that suggested survived innovation. They arranged documents on tables where both senators could observe. Names, dates, activities recorded in careful detail. Your files, she said simply. 20 years of accumulated intelligence. Every transaction, every indiscretion, every moment you thought private. She selected a page at random. Focus. Did you know your wife has been bribing customs officials? Protecting her brother's smuggling operations? The amounts are impressive. His paralyzed throat couldn't respond, but his eyes widened with recognition. Information he'd hidden even from himself, thrown back like mirror reflections. Each revelation another weight on consciousness that couldn't act. And Macedonia, your citizenship sales funded more than personal wealth. Another page. Another exposure. The Syrian merchants you've been protecting? They're Persian spies. You've been enabling enemy intelligence for decades. Unwittingly, I assume. But ignorance won't save you when this reaches the proper authorities. She let the implications settle, both men understanding their positions. Not just physical helplessness, but social destruction. The architectural punishment was temporary. The documented crimes would echo forever. Unless, fortunately, I believe in redemption through service. She gestured to the masked figures. These men once sat where you sit, experienced what you're experiencing, learned that cooperation offers better outcomes than resistance. The masks came off, revealing faces both senators recognized. Marcus Aurelius, who'd disappeared 2 years ago, supposedly fled to Italy, avoiding corruption charges. Instead, standing here as evidence of survival through submission, Gregory the Syrian, whose family had mourned him as plague victim, alive but transformed. Men who'd passed through Theodora's architecture and emerged as instruments. The purple doves revealed your sins, but they also offer salvation. She moved between the pools, trailing fingers through water at different temperatures. Serve my intelligence network. Become active participants rather than unwitting subjects. Transform from victims to agents. Focus felt the paralysis beginning to fade, fingers twitching with returning control. Not freedom but possibility. The choice between architectural punishment and architectural purpose, between destruction and reconstruction, the compound wearing off just enough to allow decision. Macedonia's sensations returned in waves. First pressure, then temperature, finally pain from the demonstration wounds, each nerve ending awakening with hypersensitivity, his body relearning feeling through overwhelming input, gasping, shaking, understanding. Choose, Theodora commanded. Exposure and execution for your crimes, or service and survival through my grace. The architecture you've experienced is nothing compared to what awaits the stubborn. Both men would accept. She knew it with the certainty of someone who'd calibrated pressure perfectly. But acceptance was just beginning. They would leave this chamber changed, carrying knowledge of innovations their minds couldn't forget, understanding that somewhere in Constantinople, rooms waited to process anyone who challenged imperial will. Your recruitment begins tomorrow, she told them. Report to the Purple Room at dawn. Bring lists of every senator you know with hidden corruptions. We have architecture to fill. She left them there, focus slowly regaining movement, Macedonia processing sensation, both understanding they'd experienced only introduction. The Purple Room contained 7 pools. They'd seen 2. 5 more waited with different compounds, different effects, different lessons in how flesh could be reformed through careful application of architectural design. The real punishment wasn't paralysis or numbness. It was knowledge, knowing such chambers existed, understanding their precision, carrying memories of helplessness that would flavor every future moment. They would serve Theodora not from loyalty but from the certainty that resistance meant returning to rooms where mirrors reflected more than just images. Marcus Aurelius helped Focus stand on legs, still remembering paralysis. Gregory tended Macedonia's wounds with salves that stung worse than the initial cuts. Former senators, now servants. Examples of architectural transformation. Proof that Theodora's revenge operated on timelines longer than single evenings. Tomorrow, you begin to understand, Marcus told them. Tonight was introduction. The Empress has architectures you can't imagine. Rooms that reshape more than flesh, chambers that reconstruct loyalty itself. They emerged from the Purple Room as dawn approached. Constantinople slept, unaware that 2 more senators had joined Theodora's network. The paralysis had passed, the numbness had faded, but the knowledge remained, carved into memory with surgical precision, understanding that beneath their city, chambers waited to process anyone who forgot that the Empress had transformed revenge into architecture. Because in 532, the Nika Riots would give her the excuse to orchestrate the greatest act of revenge in Roman history. The crowd's roar shattered windows 3 streets from the hippodrome. 30,000 voices unified in rage, their chant rolling through Constantinople like thunder. Nika, Nika, victory, victory. The same arena where 5-year-old Theodora had begged for scraps now trembled with revolution aimed at her husband's throne. She stood on the palace balcony overlooking the chaos, purple silk whipping in smoke-filled wind. Fires already consumed the eastern districts. Rioters had freed prisoners from the city jails. The blue and green factions, eternal enemies, marched together for the first time in living memory. Their target wasn't each other anymore. Their target wore a crown. Justinian paced the throne room below, his virgin awkwardness replaced by paralytic fear. They're burning the city, he whispered to his advisors. My city, God's city. His hands shook as he clutched imperial regalia that suddenly felt like chains. Theodora watched smoke columns rise from neighborhoods she'd once worked. The brothel districts, the theaters, places where she'd learned that humiliation could become fuel if you stored it properly. Let it age. Transform it into something more useful than pain. Below in the hippodrome, she recognized faces in the mob. Senator Hypatius, who'd paid to watch geese degrade her when she was 12, now leading chants against the imperial tax policies. The irony tasted sweeter than palace wine. The crowd had chosen the wrong emperor to overthrow. Your Majesty, General Belisarius appeared at her shoulder, armor reflecting firelight. The Emperor requests your presence in the council chamber. He speaks of fleeing to Chalcedon. She smiled without turning. Tell my husband I'll join him shortly. First, I need to count something. The general hesitated. In the streets below, rioters had started dragging marble statues from their pedestals, smashing representations of imperial power with hammers and rage. Each crash echoed through January air like prophecy. "Count what, Majesty?" "Faces I remember. Debts coming due." She gestured toward the hippodrome's torchlit interior. "That arena holds 30,000 rebels. Ask me how many watched a 12-year-old perform with waterfowl for their entertainment." Belisarius had learned not to question the Empress when her voice carried that particular tone. The same controlled calm she used when ordering architectural modifications, when selecting servants for special duties, when justice required precision rather than passion. Inside the council chamber, panic had replaced protocol. Senators who hadn't fled argued about negotiation. Treasury officials calculated losses. Justinian sat frozen on his throne, overwhelmed by violence he couldn't codify into law. The Virgin Emperor had spent 40 years avoiding conflict through intellectual discipline. Now, conflict had arrived anyway, carrying torches. "We must evacuate," Senator Germanus insisted. "Ships wait in the harbour. The imperial treasury can be loaded within hours. Retreat to Egypt until order is restored." Other voices joined the chorus of cowardice. Flee, negotiate, surrender. Anything to avoid confronting the mob that grew larger each hour. The hippodrome had become a revolutionary assembly. Senators who'd lost position joined merchants angry about taxes. Priests who opposed Justinian's theological positions blessed rioters between sermons. Even some palace guards had deserted, seeing opportunity in chaos. Theodora entered through doors that slammed against marble walls. The sound cut through debate like a blade through silk. She moved to Justinian's throne but didn't sit, standing beside it, above it, making every man in the room look up to meet her gaze. "You discuss fleeing from subjects who throw stones at statues." Her voice carried the same projection she'd learned performing to vast audiences. "Men who would abandon Constantinople because citizens discovered their spines." "Majesty," Germanus ventured, "the mob has already burned half the city. If we remain, we rule. If we flee, we're fugitives pretending authority still matters." She touched Justinian's shoulder, felt him flinch, then steady. "Purple makes a finer burial shroud than beggars' rags in exile." The room erupted in protest. Senators listing precedents for strategic withdrawal, generals explaining tactical disadvantages, treasurers counting costs. She let them exhaust themselves. Panic was just another performance requiring proper timing. When silence finally settled, she spoke again. 30,000 voices in the hippodrome, but only 7 gates control access. She moved to the tactical map spread across the council table. 7 exits, 7 choices. Architectural problems require architectural solutions. She traced the arena's outline with one finger, the same space where her father had died, where she'd performed degradation for copper coins, where memory had crystallized into something harder than marble. "General Belisarius, how many of your Germanic troops remain loyal?" 3,000, Majesty. Mostly Herules and Goths who care nothing for Constantinople politics. "And General Mundus, your Illyrians?" 1,500, stationed at the palace barracks. She nodded, still studying the map. More than sufficient for what architecture makes possible. The room grew quiet. Even panicking senators recognized when Theodora's mind turned toward solutions that wouldn't appear in official histories. Justinian straightened on his throne. His wife's calm had always been more terrifying than his own uncertainty. "You cannot mean." Germanus couldn't finish the thought. "I mean to give Constantinople a lesson about challenging imperial authority." She looked up from the map. "Summon Senator Hypatius. Tell him the emperor wishes to negotiate. Tell him Justinian will address the people from the hippodrome floor. Hypatius leads the mob. He's already declared himself rival emperor." "Perfect. Usurpers deserve special consideration." Her smile belonged in the purple room, not the throne room. "When he arrives for negotiation, arrest him. Quietly. His disappearance will confuse the mob. They'll wait for their leader while we position troops." The plan unfolded with mechanical precision, each element clicking into place like gears in hydraulic design. Hypatius would be detained. The mob would grow restless. Imperial heralds would announce the emperor's imminent appearance. The crowd would pack tighter into the hippodrome, eager to witness Justinian's humiliation. All 30,000 pushing through 7 gates that could be sealed. Station Germanic troops at the eastern gates, she continued. Mundus takes the west. When the arena fills completely, when anticipation peaks, when they're pressed together like cattle in a pen. She paused, letting them complete the image. Architecture determines outcome, not numbers. Belisarius understood first. His face went pale beneath his soldier's tan. The massacre would be unprecedented. 30,000 citizens. Sighed. 30,000 rebels. Who burned the Hagia Sophia? Who declared a pretender emperor? Who thought stone walls couldn't become tomb walls? She turned to Justinian. Unless my husband prefers Egyptian exile. The emperor found his voice. Or rather, found his wife's voice speaking through his authority. Prepare the troops. Seal the treasury. Empty the prisons of any remaining criminals. Ride. We'll need space for survivors worth interrogating. The council dispersed to prepare architectural solutions. Only Theodora remained with her paralyzed husband. She knelt beside his throne, taking his hands in hers. They trembled like birds against her steady grip. I cannot order such slaughter, he whispered. God will judge. God judges through imperial action. You wear purple. Act like it. She squeezed his fingers until trembling stopped. Or would you prefer I handle this personally? I have experience with that arena, with men who think spectacle means power. He looked at her then. Really looked. Seeing not the theological debate partner he'd married, but the woman who'd survived Constantinople's worst degradations. Who'd transformed from performer to empress through will harder than palace marble. Who understood that power required occasional demonstration. How many will die? Enough to matter. Fewer than would perish in civil war. She stood, smoothing his purple robes. I've waited 20 years for some of these faces. Don't deny me architectural justice. Outside, the mob's chanting grew louder. Nika, Nika. Victory, victory. They celebrated revolution, while troops moved through underground passages, while gates prepared to become trapdoors, while the hippodrome transformed from arena to abattoir. Theodora returned to her balcony, the faces below sharpened into memory. That merchant who'd paid extra for private shows. That priest who'd blessed her with one hand while groping with the other. That senator's son who'd thrown coins like feeding animals, all gathered in one convenient location, all believing their numbers meant immunity. She counted them with the focus of a child memorizing tormentors. The crowd swelled as word spread of coming imperial address, pushing through gates, filling stone seats, packing the arena floor, the architecture accommodating them all, welcoming them, embracing them, preparing to digest them. By dawn tomorrow, those stones that had witnessed her humiliation would run red with redemption. The hippodrome that had taught her about power would demonstrate its ultimate lesson. That architecture properly applied could transform 30,000 voices into 30,000 silences. Because while bodies cooled in the hippodrome, Theodora was building a surveillance network that would make the entire empire her eyes and ears. The senator's new maid seemed perfectly ordinary, except for the small purple dove tattooed behind her ear and her perfect memory for pillow talk. She arrived at Marcus Calvus's household during the spring rains, when mud made deliveries irregular and new faces attracted less scrutiny. Helena was her name, or so the employment documents claimed. 20 years old, Syrian origins, excellent references from a textile merchant's family in Antioch. Her Greek carried only the slightest accent, carefully cultivated to suggest education despite foreign birth. Calvus barely glanced at her during the introduction. Another servant for his wife to manage. Another mouth requiring wages. His attention focused instead on correspondence from suspicious merchants, calculations that wouldn't survive imperial audit. He missed how Helena's eyes tracked every document on his desk while maintaining the downcast posture of proper servitude. The purple dove hid beneath carefully arranged hair, pinned with bronze clips that drew attention away from skin. She'd practiced the hairstyle for weeks before placement, learning exactly which angles concealed while appearing natural. The tattoo throbbed sometimes, Phantom pain from needles that had marked her as Theodora's property when she was 13. 5 years of training since then. 5 years preparing for this specific household. Marcus Calvus controlled grain distribution for Constantinople's eastern districts. His position meant access to shipping manifests, storage reports, supply chains that fed the capital. It also meant opportunities for theft hidden in spoilage reports and transit losses. Helena's handlers suspected he'd been skimming for years. Her assignment was confirming suspicion and documenting methods. Standard reconnaissance for a purple dove operative. She settled into household rhythms with practiced ease. Dawn prayers with other servants. Morning duties in the family quarters. Afternoon attendance on Calvus's wife, a nervous woman who talked constantly when anxious. Evening service during meals, where wine loosened tongues and business discussions forgot servant ears. Helena absorbed it all while projecting the mild incompetence that made employers feel superior. The first week passed in careful observation. She mapped the house's architecture, noting which walls carried sound between rooms. The study adjoined the master bedroom with only wooden paneling between. Conversations in one space bled through if you knew where to listen. The kitchen chimney connected to the study's fireplace, creating an acoustic channel that amplified voices. These structural details mattered more than any locked door. Calvus conducted his real business after midnight. Helena discovered this by tracking candle consumption in his study. 3 times more wax burned during night hours than daylight suggested. She volunteered for late duties, claiming her Syrian background made her naturally nocturnal. The other servants appreciated someone willing to take unpopular shifts. Calvus appreciated servants who worked while he did. She brought him heated wine during those late sessions, moving silently through rooms where he huddled over ledgers that never appeared during legitimate audits. He grew comfortable with her presence the way men grew comfortable with furniture. Necessary, functional, ultimately invisible. Helena cultivated this blindness, while her trained memory photographed every visible document. The code he used was amateur work, simple letter substitution that any purple dove could crack within hours. She translated his entries while grinding spices in the kitchen, writing nothing down, storing everything in the mental architecture her instructors had built. Grain shipments recorded at 70% of actual weight. The missing 30% sold to Armenian traders who paid in Persian gold. Profits hidden in construction costs for warehouses that existed only on paper. Week 3 brought the breakthrough. Calvus had grown careless with wine and familiarity. He left a letter unsealed on his desk while using the chamber pot. Helena had 40 seconds to memorize its contents. Her eyes moved in the scanning pattern they'd drilled thousands of times. Left to right, top to bottom, absorbing words like water soaking into cloth. The letter discussed expansion, more senators joining Calvus's network, systematic theft orchestrated across multiple districts, names that would interest Theodora greatly, dates that suggested acceleration, plans that threatened imperial grain supplies during the upcoming campaign season. Helena filed each detail in her memory palace, while maintaining the vacant expression of a servant waiting with fresh linens. That night, she composed her first report, not with ink that could betray, with predetermined movements at the district market. Buying figs meant negative findings. Dates indicated positive intelligence. The specific stalls visited encoded details through a system of numerical correspondence. She purchased items that spelled out Calvus's entire operation to handlers who appeared to be competing merchants. The intelligence moved through Constantinople's shadow network. Purple doves at various social levels passed information upward. Market servant to household cook, to palace attendant to administrative secretary. Each link unaware of the chain's full length. Each operative knowing only their immediate contacts. The report reached Theodora within 2 days, decoded and cross-referenced with intelligence from other sources. Helena received new instructions through the same market system. Continue observation. Document expansion. Identify all participants. The network Calvus belonged to was larger than anticipated. More profitable, more dangerous. The Empress wanted complete mapping before moving against it. Patient architecture of revenge that relied on total information. Calvus's wife provided unexpected assistance. Livia grew fond of the quiet Syrian servant who listened without judgment. She complained about her husband's late hours, his mysterious visitors, the way he counted coins when he thought she was sleeping. Her nervous chatter revealed patterns Helena hadn't observed directly. Which senators visited, how often, whether they came alone or with guards who waited in the courtyard. The most frequent visitor was Photius, who controlled customs assessments. His presence explained how stolen grain left Constantinople without documentation, another piece clicking into place. Helena served wine during their meetings, noting how they spoke in references she now understood. Weather reports meant shipping schedules. Construction delays indicated payment problems. Sick relatives were code for officials requiring larger bribes. She began creating detailed profiles, not just names and crimes, but personalities. Photius drank moderately but had a weakness for Syrian sweets that reminded him of his grandmother. Calvus preferred young wine and grew sentimental about his military service after the third cup. These details mattered. Human intelligence went beyond simple documentation. It required understanding what made targets vulnerable. The walls of Calvus's house became Helena's allies. She learned their acoustic properties like a musician learning an instrument. The spot in the pantry, where conversations in the study became clear. The bedroom corner, where voices from the garden carried perfectly. Architecture designed for privacy betrayed its owners to someone trained in structural surveillance. Month 2 brought acceleration. More senators joined the network. The stolen quantities increased. Gold flowed in patterns that suggested foreign influence. Helena documented it all while maintaining her facade. The vacant servant who brought warm towels, who aired bedding, who existed at the periphery of important men's vision. Her purple dove tattoo throbbed with each new piece of intelligence, reminding her who she served, why she existed. The other servants noticed nothing unusual. Helena had integrated perfectly. She shared gossip about harmless topics, complained about appropriate inconveniences, formed the shallow friendships that made household service bearable. None suspected the archive building in her trained mind, the reports flowing through market purchases, the death sentences she was writing in produce transactions. Photius made the fatal mistake during a summer evening when wine and heat loosened more than tongues. He brought documents usually kept in treasury vaults, shipping contracts with official seals. Evidence of the network's full scope. Helena watched him spread papers across Calvus's desk, explaining new routes that would triple their profits. Every page visible from where she stood with the wine pitcher, every detail absorbed. She encoded this intelligence in a pattern of spice purchases that made the merchant smile. He knew something significant was being communicated. The quantities, the combinations, the timing. Helena bought enough saffron to signal immediate importance, enough pepper to indicate multiple targets. The merchant would earn his commission today. Palace response came within hours, not through markets this time, but through direct contact. A purple dove Helena had never met appeared at the servant's entrance. She wore the bronze hairpins that identified senior operatives. Her message was simple: maintain position. Final documentation required. The Empress herself was orchestrating the network's destruction. Helena felt the weight of that attention. Somewhere in the palace, Theodora was reading reports written in market goods, planning architecture of consequences for men who thought theft was just economics. The Purple Dove Network was about to demonstrate why challenging imperial authority required more than clever accounting. The end came during a feast Calvus hosted for his conspirators. 8 senators gathered to celebrate expanded operations. Helena served course after course while memorizing faces, names, specific admissions of guilt. They toasted their success with wine she'd poured, made jokes about imperial incompetence, counted profits from theft that would feed Justinian's enemies. She excused herself during the third course, claiming kitchen duties. Instead, she climbed to the roof where signal fires were visible across Constantinople's skyline. 3 flames in specific positions meant operational success. 2 meant compromise. 1 meant abort. Helena lit 4 torches in the pattern that had no official meaning. The code, purple doves, used only for highest priority. Immediate action required. All targets present. Palace guards arrived before dessert. They moved through servant entrances Helena had mapped weeks earlier, surrounded the dining hall while senators savoured honeyed dates. The arrest was so swift that Calvus still held his wine cup when shackles closed on his wrists. His eyes found Helena standing in the doorway. Understanding arrived too late. The vacant servant suddenly sharp with purpose. The purple dove visible now that concealment no longer mattered. The other servants screamed, fled, cowered. Helena simply walked to the captain of guards and began reciting. Names, dates, amounts. The complete architecture of a criminal network preserved in her perfect memory. Each detail another stone in the tomb these senators had built for themselves. The captain's scribe struggled to keep pace with her recitation. Calvus tried to speak, to deny, to bargain. The guards had been instructed to prevent conversation. Cloth gags for men whose words had condemned them. They were dragged away in silence while Helena continued her testimony. The wine she'd served still stained their lips. The food she'd prepared still filled their stomachs. Every comfort they'd enjoyed had been administered by their executioner. The household dissolved within hours. Other servants questioned and released. Property sealed pending imperial audit. Evidence collected with the thoroughness of handlers who'd received specific instructions. Helena walked out through the front door she'd entered as a servant, her assignment complete. Her purple dove training vindicated. Another successful mission in Theodora's expanding architecture of surveillance. She reported to a safe house near the harbour. Other purple doves had gathered there. Young men and women who'd spent months in various households. Each one carrying intelligence that would reshape Constantinople's power structure. They compared experiences with the detachment of professionals, discussed improved techniques, analyzed security failures that had allowed penetration. The handler who debriefed Helena was the woman with bronze hairpins. She transcribed every detail while asking questions that probed for missed intelligence. The Purple Dove network never assumed completeness. Always pressed for the overlooked detail, the forgotten conversation, the servant who might have known more than appeared. Calvus's wife, the handler noted. Innocent, ignorant, not innocent, Helena replied. She enjoyed wealth without questioning its source, but she provided no active assistance. Recommendation? Exile. Confiscation of property. She has family in Antioch who'll take her. Helena paused, then added what mattered more than mercy. She talked freely about everyone who visited. Future intelligence source if handled correctly. The handler smiled, recognizing the strategic thinking that separated excellent purple doves from merely good ones. Helena had learned to see beyond immediate assignments, to recognize how today's target could become tomorrow's asset. The network grew through such conversions. Your next placement has been selected, the handler said. Persian merchant family, recent arrivals, suspiciously wealthy. Helena nodded, ready to become someone else, to infiltrate another household, to serve wine while documenting treason. The purple dove on her neck had healed years ago, but its meaning remained fresh. She belonged to an empress who understood that information was architecture, that surveillance was power, that well-placed servants could topple senators as easily as armies. Because the shadow network Theodora had built didn't just watch Constantinople. It reached across the known world, and even sacred ground wasn't safe from purple dove infiltration. The same mouth that had performed unspeakable acts hours before now recited prayers in the Hagia Sophia, while bishops nodded approvingly. Theodora knelt on marble that cost more than most citizens earned in lifetimes, her voice carrying the practiced reverence of someone who understood performance extended beyond theatre walls. Incense smoke curled around her prostrate form as she whispered liturgies in flawless Greek, each word calculated to demonstrate piety that would have shocked anyone who knew where she'd spent the previous night. Bishop Constantine stood 3 pews away, his fingers trembling against prayer beads. She'd selected his name deliberately during morning devotions, praising his sermon on redemption with enthusiasm that made other worshippers turn to stare. The bishop's face flushed with pride and something else. Recognition? Fear? He'd paid for private performances years ago, back when she danced with scarves and shame. The monasteries she funded had no exits. That architectural detail, mattered more than the gold she poured into religious foundations across Constantinople. 15 monasteries bore plaques thanking the empress for her generosity, each one designed with specific modifications. Walls too high for climbing, windows too narrow for escape, underground passages that connected to chambers where theological debate took forms the church would never acknowledge, holy ground transformed into holding cells for those who discovered too much. Sister Agatha managed the convent of repentant Magdalenes with efficiency born from experience. Former Purple Dove trainer, she understood how religious authority could mask other purposes. The young women seeking sanctuary there found more than prayer and contemplation. They found instructors who taught them to weaponize scripture, to deploy faith like a blade wrapped in silk. Morning prayers ended with Theodora distributing alms to beggars clustered at the church doors. She pressed coins into filthy palms while bishops praised her charity. None noticed the small parchments hidden beneath certain donations. Instructions for her agents, reports from the night's intelligence gathering. The beggars weren't random unfortunates but part of her network, positioned to observe who entered churches at unusual hours. Her theological writings could be read two ways. The treatise on divine suffering she'd published drew acclaim from scholars who missed its double meanings. Every paragraph contained coded intelligence for purple doves trained in her cipher. Discussions of Christ's Passion described interrogation techniques. Meditations on martyrdom outlined methods for extracting confessions. The vocabulary of faith became a manual for manipulating flesh, hidden in plain sight among library shelves. Justinian thought his wife's religious scholarship reflected genuine conversion. He'd quote her writings during council meetings, unaware he was reciting instructions for psychological torture wrapped in scriptural analysis. The Virgin Emperor's innocence extended beyond physical inexperience. He couldn't conceive that someone would use holy texts as operational handbooks, but experienced theologians recognized the danger. Patriarch Menas had survived 3 regime changes by reading subtext as carefully as scripture. When Theodora presented her latest manuscript on the nature of redemption, his hands shook, turning pages. Each chapter escalated in audacity. Surface discussions of salvation through suffering, deeper implications about power through carefully managed pain, deepest level containing specific names, dates, locations of religious figures who'd opposed imperial policy. He burned the manuscript that night, sent word he'd found it too profound for wide distribution. Theodora smiled when receiving his response. The message was received. The threat understood. The patriarch would support her religious initiatives, or find himself subject to the redemption procedures her writing described. The afternoon brought visits to her sponsored monasteries. Crowds gathered to watch the empress demonstrate piety through architectural patronage. She laid cornerstones for new chapels, blessed expanded dormitories, praised abbots for their spiritual guidance. Each ceremony perfectly choreographed to project imperial devotion. But even saints die, and she had preparations to make. The symptoms had started 6 months earlier. Blood in places blood shouldn't appear. Pain that palace physicians couldn't explain. Weight falling away despite desperate eating. She recognized cancer's signature from watching other women die in Constantinople's brothels. The disease didn't care about purple silk or palace walls. It consumed empresses as efficiently as whores. The diagnosis transformed every action into legacy construction. Each monastery founded became a monument to her transformation. Each theological text published carved her interpretation into history. She was writing herself into sainthood through sheer documentation, creating evidence of piety so overwhelming that future generations couldn't ignore it. Brother Marcus noticed her physical decline during evening prayers. The way she gripped altar rails for support, how her voice cracked during longer passages, the careful positioning that minimized visible trembling. He'd trained purple doves to recognize weakness. Now he watched his empress displaying all the signs of someone managing invisible agony. She caught him staring and smiled. Not the predator's expression he remembered from training sessions. Something sadder, more human. The smile of someone who knew their performance was approaching its final act. Her midnight writing sessions intensified as her body weakened. Not intelligence reports or coded instructions, actual theological meditations on death, transformation, and the architecture of memory. She was documenting her own mythology, creating the narrative that would survive when flesh failed, every word chosen to support future veneration. The monasteries without exits served dual purposes now, still processing those who knew too much, but also preserving evidence of her charitable works. The disappeared inmates provided perfect silence about activities inside. The architectural innovations would outlive questions about their purpose. Future generations would see only the Empress's generosity in funding religious institutions. She met with architects in secret, not for new constructions but for modifications to existing structures, hidden chambers sealed with her personal effects, documents that supported sainthood while others burned. The selection process required delicate balance. Enough evidence of transformation, not enough to reveal methods. Architecture, serving hagiography. Cancer carved away everything non-essential. The flesh that had performed for senators, the beauty that had seduced an emperor. What remained was will shaped into religious authority. She attended services when pain permitted, voiced theological arguments when breath allowed, projected faith with the same intensity she'd once projected desire. The purple light streaming through cathedral windows reminded her of the room where she'd orchestrated her death scene. Full circle from theatrical performance to religious theatre. Both required precise staging. Both demanded audiences believe in transformation. The difference was scale and permanence. Priests who'd once purchased her services now blessed her fevered forehead. The irony would have made her laugh if laughter didn't trigger coughing that brought blood. They saw only the reformed sinner, the generous patroness, the emperor's devoted wife who'd discovered salvation through suffering. Her greatest performance, played to audiences who'd forgotten her earlier roles. She documented final instructions in theological language, which monasteries should receive imperial funding in perpetuity, which texts should be preserved in palace archives, which religious figures deserved promotion after her death. Each directive strengthened the narrative of saint rather than manipulator. Even dying became propaganda. The final communion arrived on a golden plate that trembled in her skeletal grip, wine mixed with opium to manage pain, bread that her throat could barely swallow. Bishop Constantine administered the sacrament with tears streaming down his face. Whether from genuine emotion or remembered shame, she couldn't determine. Didn't care. The performance was what mattered. As cancer consumed her body, Theodora orchestrated one final performance. Her own death scene, complete with purple lighting and the destruction of an empire's darkest secrets. The servants' footsteps echoed through marble corridors as they carried another load of documents to the furnaces. Each bundle represented years of accumulated power, names and dates that could topple dynasties, confessions extracted in chambers where water reached precise depths. Theodora's breathing rattled between commands, but her pointing finger never wavered. That stack, next. Those scrolls there. The record of Senator Marcellus's preferences, documented in clinical detail, fed to flames that danced like memories being erased. The bronze mirrors throughout the purple room reflected her dying form into infinity. She'd arranged them herself that morning, calculating angles while her physicians protested. The purple silk draped across her cancer-ravaged body caught light from windows positioned decades earlier. Every detail orchestrated, every shadow planned. Death would find her exactly where she intended, surrounded by the architecture of her revenge. Her scribes worked in shifts, hands cramping as they transcribed final orders between her coughing fits. Burn the records from Cyprus. Preserve the theological manuscripts. Destroy anything linking purple doves to palace funding. The sorting required precision her fevered mind struggled to maintain. Which secrets would die with her? Which would echo through history? Which would transform her from monster to saint? The smoke grew thicker as servants fed correspondence to flames. Letters from governors documenting bribes. Testimony from merchants who'd paid for silence. Detailed accounts of activities in pools where temperature had been calibrated to break resistance. Her life's work, turning to ash with the same efficiency she'd applied to its creation. The servants' eyes watered, though whether from smoke or knowledge of what they destroyed, none could say. Footsteps approached through the antechamber, heavy, uncertain. She recognized Justinian's gait, the way his feet dragged when confronting situations law couldn't codify. Her husband entered wearing purple that made his grief-pale skin look translucent. 17 years of marriage, and he still approached her deathbed like a virgin approaching his wedding night. Some innocents survived everything, even in emperors, the physicians say. He stopped, watching servants carry another load past. His eyes tracked documents disappearing into flame. "What are you burning?" "Sins," she whispered, her voice scraping like parchment against stone. "Mine. Theirs. Everyone's." A cough brought blood to her lips. She let it remain, knowing how the color would catch purple light. Architecture can't burn, but evidence can. He moved closer, drawn by habit despite revulsion at her deterioration. The woman who'd seduced him with theological debate had melted down to essential structure. Bones visible through skin. Eyes enormous in her skull face, but still directing, still orchestrating, still transforming reality through will alone. "The monasteries need funding confirmed," she continued, gesturing weakly toward documents awaiting his seal. "The convents require protection after I'm gone. My theological writings must be preserved in palace archives." Each instruction dropped another stone in the foundation of her manufactured sainthood. "Promise me." His hand found hers, careful not to disturb the tubes draining infection from her ravaged body. "Anything," he whispered, and she heard the virgin boy inside the emperor, still believing in redemption, still trusting that transformation meant what churches taught. His innocence had been her greatest weapon. Now, it would be her monument. More documents fed the flames. Reports from Alexandria, coded communications from Antioch, the entire network she'd built over decades, dissolving into smoke that mixed with frankincense. Servants stumbled from heat and horror, but she held them with her gaze. Keep burning, keep feeding, keep destroying evidence of who she'd really been. "Send word to the purple chambers," she told her chief scribe. "All operations cease at dawn. Seal the pools, dismiss the handlers. The architecture remains, but its purpose dies with me." The words came between bubbles of blood. Let future generations wonder at structures they can't explain. She'd selected which sins would survive. Minor corruptions that humanized without horrifying. Theft that could be blamed on necessity. Violence justified by circumstances. The careful construction of a narrative where a prostitute's daughter became empress through divine intervention rather than architectural innovation, where suffering led to sainthood rather than systematized revenge. The bronze mirrors showed her from every angle as she arranged herself on the bed. Purple light caught her profile just so. Shadows emphasized suffering rather than satisfaction. She'd performed for worse audiences with less preparation. This final show required only that she die perfectly, that she leave a corpse positioned for veneration rather than horror. "Bring the bishops," she commanded. "Tell them the Empress requests last rites." They would find her arranged like a painting, hands clasped in prayer, eyes fixed on heaven. The purple light would stream across her still form at exactly the right angle, death catching her mid-transformation. The prostitute finally, completely, becoming the saint. But first, the burning had to finish. Every document, every record, every piece of evidence that connected her to pools designed for breaking spirits, to children trained as weapons, to architecture that had processed Constantinople's elite through carefully calibrated degradation. The servants fed bundle after bundle to flames that roared like dragons swallowing history.